The end of the American Civil War marked a turning point in the history of the United States. While the North emerged victorious, the South was left in ruins and its people deeply divided. For former Confederate soldiers, the defeat meant grappling with a new reality. Their way of life and their cause were lost. Some chose to adapt to the new circumstances, while others clung to the past or even left the country. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and in today's video we'll discover what happened to Confederates after the American Civil War. Despite 4 years of brutal bloodshed, the end of the American Civil War was not a time of vengeance and punishment, with Union troops lording over and abusing the erstwhile rebels. President Abraham Lincoln ordered that surrendering Confederates be offered the most liberal and honorable terms. An order the Union's overall commander and future president, General Ulysses S. Grant, followed. When his Confederate counterpart, General Robert E. Lee, formally surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, Grant permitted all soldiers in Lee's army to keep their personal effects and horses. When the Confederates formally handed over their battle flags and weaponry 3 days later, Union officers were ordered to show the utmost military respect, including saluting as both officers and rank and file surrendered their arms and standards. Though other Confederate armies and formations would surrender in the upcoming months, the ceremonies at Appomattox mark the accepted end of the American Civil War. The war had left the southern United States devastated, as scorched earth campaigns by generals like William Tecumseh Sherman gutted infrastructure, and the abolition of slavery collapsed its plantation-based economy. The federal government was left debating how best to bring the rebels back into the fold, with President Lincoln desiring quick and amicable reintegration. Lincoln proposed a general amnesty for any who had taken up the Confederate cause, and that Southern states be readmitted under the political control of the Southern whites. Once 10% of a given state's voters had sworn an oath of allegiance to the United States, the state would be readmitted to the Union and could reestablish its government and internal systems. This plan was rejected outright by radical Republicans, a faction of Lincoln's party that sought to punish the South for slavery, insurrection, or both. Radicals in Congress proposed their own plan, requiring a full 50% of Southern voters to swear their loyalty to the Union before their state could be readmitted, a figure that could not be reached so close to the war and would have effectively prohibited the readmittance of Southern states. But Lincoln kept to his hopes, creating a legislative deadlock between him and the radical Republicans, a deadlock John Wilkes Booth broke at Ford's Theater. The death of Lincoln marked a turn in the fortunes of the former Confederates, as former slaveholder and Tennessean Andrew Johnson assumed the highest office in the land. Reconstruction, the turbulent post-war period, had begun. Southern devastation was economic and demographic. 200 to 300,000 men died while wearing the Confederate gray, a full quarter of the male population between 17 and 50. Families were left without fathers and sons, businesses without owners and workers, and political offices vacant. Those men who survived the war returned to find their home states a smoking ruin, with Union General Charles Schurz describing the site former rebels returned to: a broad black streak of ruin and desolation, the fences all gone, lonesome smokestacks surrounded by dark heaps of ashes and cinders, marking spots where human habitation had stood. The American Civil War and its subsequent aftermath would have profound and long-lasting effects on the country, some of which linger to this day. Thanks to the sponsor of today's video, War and Peace Civil War, the ultimate strategy game set in the American Civil War era, you can reshape the course of history. Challenge your friends to epic battles in real-time multiplayer, forge alliances with other players, and work together to conquer the battlefield. Use cunning strategies to outsmart your opponents and prove your tactical prowess on the battlefield by leading your troops to victory with a range of powerful units and tactics, from cavalry charges to artillery bombardments. War and Peace offers endless hours of fun and excitement to both new players and seasoned strategists alike, with addictive gameplay, stunning graphics, and a community of players ready to take take on the challenge. Step into the shoes of an American Civil War general today and support our channel by downloading War and Peace Civil War for free using our link in the description below. This broad black streak, teamed with destitute refugees, masses of former slave owners, average Southern people, and newly freed slaves, left to contend with the physical and economic ruin. A full 2/3 of the South's wealth had been consumed by the Civil War, leaving what was once a hotbed of agrarian industry unable to even feed its population. South Carolina, the state where the war arguably started, was forced to sell 300,000 or $5.5 million in today's dollars worth of bonds just to buy corn to feed its starving population. The Treasury Department did little to help the situation, with Treasury agents sweeping into the South to seize abandoned property, including stocks of the South's last major resource, cotton. Treasury agents decreed that this cotton was to be seized as war reparations, but the men in charge of such dealings were far from honest. A system emerged in which Southern cotton owners would avoid having their stocks seized by swearing that they had never been disloyal to the United States. However, these arrangements often involved collusion between wealthy Southerners and Treasury agents. As a result, a portion of the unseized cotton would be sold by the agents for personal profit. Although most returned to eke out a living in their ruined land, not all were willing to abide by the South's new social order or risk persecution for their participation in the war. A number of Confederate politicians fled to Europe, such as Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin and Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, who found shelter in Britain before dying in Paris and returning home on a pardon, respectively. Confederate President Jefferson Davis attempted a similar escape but was captured by Federal cavalry. Rank-and-file Confederates cast their eyes even further south, with a number settling in Mexico. These men reasoned that the United States would come to blows with Mexico again, and they could once more march against the Yankees. But Mexico was a nation without slavery, an institution many ex-Confederates still held close to their hearts, and as luck would have it, so did the Empire of Brazil. Sensing a new economic opportunity for his vast nation, Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II offered cheap farmland and sanctuary to any Confederates who settled in Brazil, intent on leveraging Southern expertise in farming cotton with local slave labor. 20,000 Confederates took Pedro up on his offer, establishing the town of Americana, roughly 260 miles from the city of Sao Paulo. The immigrants found Brazil to their liking, with one transplant musing, the war-worn soldier, the bereaved parent, the oppressed patriot, the homeless and despoiled can find refuge from the trials which beset them, and a home not haunted by the eternal remembrance of harrowing scenes of sorrow and death. The citizens of Americana continue to celebrate Confederate Memorial Days and exhibit reverence for 19th century Southern culture, even as Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, and many prominent rebels, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee among them, condemned the Americana Project in their lifetimes. It was these same prominent rebels that found themselves squarely in President Johnson's sights. While a general amnesty was declared for rank-and-file Confederates, an exception was made for those with property worth more than $20,000 or $370,000 in modern times. This placed wealthy planters and Confederate leadership in the position of having to specifically and publicly apply for clemency, supplicating themselves before Washington. Other exceptions included Confederate President Davis, who was kept manacled under strict guard while the US decided what to charge him with. The conditions of his imprisonment made Davis a martyr to Southerners and earned him sympathy from the Yankee public. Though Davis would never be tried for any crimes against the United States, other high-ranking Confederates would be indicted for treason, and one, Confederate officer Henry Wirz, was executed for war crimes. In Wirz's case, for the deplorable and deadly conditions of the Andersonville prison. Yet even as his government made these shows of force, Johnson followed many of Lincoln's ideas for Reconstruction, to the point of being more lenient in readmitting states. Johnson declared that North Carolina could reapply for admission when its citizens had written a new state constitution and formed a government loyal to the United States, eliminating the requirements for oaths of allegiance. This set a precedent, and the unrestored states rushed to meet these terms themselves in hopes of rejoining the Union without federal interference, and many former Confederate luminaries would use their state's readmission as a ticket back to political power. All in all, the former vice president of the Confederacy, 4 Confederate generals, 5 Confederate colonels, 6 Confederate cabinet officers, and 58 Confederate congressmen went to Washington thanks to the 1865 election. Across the South, candidates for official positions often had "Late of the Confederacy" printed on their tickets to solicit support for their election. Some of those elected proudly wore their uniforms to their state's legislative sessions. However, Southerners would join the government to promote unity and Reconstruction, such as noted Confederate General James Longstreet. Longstreet was initially indicted for treason, but his case was dismissed at the insistence of Union General Grant. Writing in a New Orleans paper regarding Reconstruction, he stated that the war was made upon Republican issues, and it seems to me fair and just that the settlement should be made accordingly. Longstreet would go on to join the Republican Party, promoting Reconstruction and criticizing his former commander, Robert E. Lee, at any opportunity. His position on Reconstruction was deemed treacherous by most Southerners. White Southerners, regardless of their feelings on Reconstruction, could not tolerate the sight of their land being occupied by federal troops, many of whom were black. They bristled at this, seeing the Federals as invaders and the presence of black soldiers as a calculated insult. In reality, the quick establishment of state governments under Johnson's presidency meant actual troop numbers in the South were small, and they dwindled rapidly with each year of Reconstruction. But racism was not limited to being insulted at the presence of black troops. Slavery may have legally been over, but the South sought to maintain white supremacy in every facet of life. While Southerners' fear for their position was existential, Reconstruction meant voting rights for black people, a prospect the former Confederates saw as little more than a ploy to create one-party Republican rule. As states were reorganized, legislators pushed to pass black codes that granted black citizens basic rights on paper, but in reality placed so many restrictions and caveats on them that black Southerners were reduced to near slave status. Black citizens were compelled to enter into paid labor contracts that put them into indentured servitude to whoever employed them, with individuals empowered to arrest and return any black employee who left their job before their contract expired. The federal government saw these acts as an attempt to revive slavery in all but name, something unacceptable to the Republican-controlled Congress. In order to stave off attempts at reintroducing slavery in a new guise, the federal government had created the Freedmen's Bureau. While this agency was set up shortly prior to the end of the war to assist refugees and displaced persons of all races, it was intended to assist recently freed slaves in particular. The Bureau set up schools and hospitals, mediated labor negotiations between businesses and emancipated workers, and held confiscated land to be parceled out as 40 acres and a mule. President Johnson, however, pressured the Bureau to return confiscated lands to their original Confederate owners, with freedmen receiving little land of their own. The Bureau was more successful in establishing schools and hospitals, treating hundreds of thousands of patients, and educating many first-generation students. However, these acts ran contrary to former Confederate values, and the recently reconstituted state governments made it clear that the Bureau had no real authority in their borders. Former Confederates saw the Bureau as virtually a foreign government forced upon them and supported by an army of occupation, while others declared it an enemy of Southern sovereignty. President Johnson soon came out as an enemy of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, vetoing an extension to its funding and essentially shutting the organization down. former Confederates soon began enforcing the Black Codes through ad hoc violence, with some of these bandit gangs growing so powerful that federal troops had to meet them in pitched battle. These protective societies enjoyed immense public support, to the point that one such collective, the Ku Klux Klan, became a national scourge, with the election of former Confederate raider Nathan Bedford Forrest as its supreme leader. The KKK determined that the ad hoc attacks were not enough. Southern blacks had to be reminded of their place through terror. An epidemic of violence erupted, with lynchings of black people and white Northerners, voter intimidation, and public displays of grim pageantry used to deliver a simple message. We, the white Southerners, are still in charge, and it will stay that way. Although the federal government passed laws targeting the KKK and sent troops into southern states to root them out, former Confederate soldiers had succeeded in their goals of regaining political power and re-establishing the social mores of the Old South. With the end of Reconstruction and the withdrawal of federal troops, they were able to rebuild their communities and institutions nearly as they had been before the war. The impact of their efforts continue to mark American social and political disputes to this day.